This is Matt Smith. He is the managing director at Mass Design Group. And several of you know because you've asked for someone from Mass Design Group to join us as a speaker. They're a little bit different, right? Their firm is, I'm going to say, essentially spread across the world in a lot of ways. Their structure is very different than, say, who's right down the street, an Axis or a Ratio or some of the traditional architecture firms that are here in the city. And Matt's background is a little bit different as well. And so I'm sure he'll touch on that here in just a minute. But Matt is heading up the Santa Fe office, right? So Matt's heading up the Santa Fe office. Mass has a number of offices in the US, but they have outposts in a variety of places around the world where they work. So with that, Matt, you want to take it away?
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, thanks so much for having me. And what I'll do is just share this deck that I presented a little bit ago. I've added some additional slides. I think that what's really interesting about architecture is how architects are in the position to make really critical decisions on who builds, how materials are selected, their provenance, how people are involved in the process of design. And I think that's really important. It means there's a lot of power in your hands. So my background is actually in nonprofit management and organizational management and development. So I have lived and worked abroad and have been with Mass for almost 6 years running our operations. And then most recently actually focusing on what we've called R&D. So sort of new programs and ventures. I'll talk about those in a moment. But I've been really interested in learning about the model of practice of architecture firms and also how Mass as a nonprofit adds to that kind of ecosystem, and how our organizational design can be structured to really further our mission and support the mission delivery of our partners, what other people might call our clients. So I wanted to give a little background on kind of my understanding of how architectural practice has changed. One has been established and then changed, over the 20th century. A couple examples of nonprofit or sort of not profit-seeking organizational structures and how they create value for the communities they serve and for the partners they work with. And then I'll talk a little bit more about Mass and just how we're structured and kind of calibrated to do that for the organizations that we work with. And then, of course, have ample time for Q&A. Hopefully you're interested and you have questions. So let me just get started. And I like to start with this quote from Whitney Young. And I'll read it. So he said at the keynote of the 1968 AIA convention that you are not a profession that's distinguished itself by your social and civic contributions to the cause of civil rights. And I'm sure this has not come to you as any shock. You're most distinguished by your thunderous silence and your complete irrelevance. And this didn't happen. This didn't just happen. We didn't just suddenly get to this situation. It was carefully planned. And I think that in part is due to, one, I think an American view of neoliberal capitalism that largely came out of the vision of this man, Milton Friedman, who said, there is only one and only one social responsibility of business, and it's to use its resources and engage in activities designed to increase its profits so long as it stays within the rules of the game, as it kind of operates legally. And so, I think that, Whitney Young's critique is one that, I think sat pretty heavily on architects in 1968 and has since then. And so, I'm interested in exploring this question as are my colleagues at Mass and other firms that we work with that we consider peers, which is how do models of practice hurt or strengthen causes of social justice? And, what I kind of posit is that a profit-seeking structure not necessarily for the fault of its own, but really by design, means that it's not able to serve certainly communities that can't pay, but actually can further social inequity as a result. And so I want to give a couple examples of that, but I'll talk through how we got here. And then again, like I mentioned, give some case studies of organizations that I think are doing really interesting models of architectural practice, creating value for the communities and partners they serve, while not necessarily using profit as the kind of key pursuit. So really quickly, let's go over what profit is. So, very basically, it means the difference between your income and your expenses. So ideally, you have a positive result, a positive balance, and that's your profit. Your profit margin is the relationship. So the percentage of your profit with respect to your income. So a lot of people will aim for a 10-20% profit margin is what I think most organizations will throw out there as their targets. And it means that they're making really decisions that are going to maximize that profit margin. But also profit means more than just sort of the result of an equation, but also has been something that is seen as a net positive, a social good. So if you're profitable, you're efficient. You're creating value for your community if you're profitable. And if you're not profitable, you must be doing something wrong. And I want to upend that a little bit. So the way that design firms typically interpret profit is this cost plus model, contracting that you're often working on a fixed fee that is typically part of seen as a percentage of project costs. And I can talk about that in a second of how we got here. But in a sense, that fixed fee minus your operational cost is what you have as your profit, and that profit as a result of the fixed fee is usually around 10%. But for many architects, it's much less. When I give presentations, often I talk about how we're a nonprofit architecture firm, and the architects in the audience laugh and say, "Well, we're all nonprofits," which is funny, but also probably testament to maybe the failing of this structure. So how did we get here? Well, there's a couple theories actually that we've explored, in conversations with our board and through some of our research. One is that the Wartime and Procurement Act for World War II actually set a ceiling for cost plus fixed fee contracts. So as the United States was preparing for war and was building infrastructure, and was really pushing contracts through, they said that you can't exceed a 7% fee on top of your cost plus fixed fee for infrastructure with the U.S. And then another theory is actually kind of doing the opposite. It was setting a price floor, but ultimately kind of structuring this idea that there is a sort of fixed percentage linking architectural fees to construction costs. And that's largely been inherited from the Royal Institute of British Architects, interpreted by the AIA here in the US, which set a series of standards around building typologies based on their sector, and then using cost really as a proxy for building complexity. That is, for larger scale projects, they were more complex, and you had kind of a sliding scale, as you can see here. But what that kind of did is that you had these bounds that were structured, and ultimately this AIA fee structure was upended through two antitrust lawsuits under the Sherman Antitrust Act, I think in 1978 and then in the early 90s, where the AIA was forbidden from using this price structure that actually protected architects by kind of creating a price floor. That is that, the AIA would say that if you don't follow these price structures and you charge a client under this price floor, you risk losing your license. The U.S. government argued successfully that was creating a monopolistic situation. And the unfortunate thing is that in kind of the destruction of that, you had a kind of race to the bottom. So the legacy of having a sort of, say, 10 to 7% fee as a relation to construction costs stayed. But then you had competition actually trying to go below that. by removing the price floor as a result of those antitrust lawsuits. And so what it meant was that you had to kind of structure your practice in a few different ways to ultimately maximize your profit. And these are kind of like three examples of sort of potential models of design practice. And this graph is showing a marginal cost curve. So, understanding profit margins is that, you want to find a major, they sort of maximize your distance between your income, your marginal income, and your marginal cost. And that's what this graph shows. So green is income, red is your cost curve. And what they're seeking to do is have the biggest difference between their marginal costs and the marginal income. And so what you see organizations practice is you might have small firms in this scenario that are focusing on high margin projects, mostly high-end residential. These are small shops, and that's the case for most architecture firms in the U.S. They're very small, and they basically have this profit maximizing formula where they can do a couple projects at once. They can't grow past that because that'll increase their costs. So they're gonna do a few so like every year that'll maximize their costs. They won't grow, but that's kind of the name of the game here. Other firms will assume more of like a high volume situation. So you can imagine that they might be doing, say, lower cost, smaller projects, but they're doing lots of them. And they're finding ways that they can cut time on pre-design, on design itself too, to effectively stamp out, say, suburban homes. And so what you need to do in this scenario is you have to have a lot of projects that are pretty large to really maximize your profit. So these might be larger firms, they'll take larger projects, but you don't have a focus on design. You're going to focus on how do you kind of repeat the same process to maximize your profit. And then there's other projects other firms that might take a sort of large project approach where they may be calibrated, having a large team, sort of deep specialization in certain areas, like maybe they're working on, say, airports or hospitals, but they have to take on large projects in order for them to maximize their profit. And they may do a handful of them, but it means that they can't take on smaller projects because of their size. They would be doing too many of them to really kind of be sustainable. And what it kind of means is that you're sort of in each of these scenarios missing a major population, which is often those folks, community-based organizations, justice-focused organizations, nonprofits, that are kind of the organizations that we tend to work the most with. And I'll give an example of how this sort of fixed fee model, and especially linking that fee to construction costs, creates a perverse incentive, meaning that it actually incentivizes people to work in areas that are wealthier and often, perhaps might not need architectural services as much as, say, other communities might. And I'll pick on Bjarke Engels here. And this is, for a firm that's saying, like, suppose you are a firm pursuing high margin projects, where would you rather work? Would you rather work in New York City, where you have an extremely high cost of construction per square foot, which means that you can charge a much higher fee as a relation to that cost of construction, or would might you work in a place like Northern Rwanda, where in this case, the University of Global Health Equity is training rural health practitioners in a rural context. But the housing on this campus was between $900 to $120 a square foot. So, very different economic construct here. And, basically we've set up through sort of our model of practice and this sort of linking our fees to construction costs, a perverse incentive that means that you have more architects serving high-end urban spaces than certainly rural, lower income spaces. And so part of the result of the antitrust lawsuits that happened in the US was that, as you saw a narrowing of the fee and the ability for architects to pay, they had to kind of restrict what they actually provided to partners too. So in effect, by saying, well, you're not paying me as much, so I'm going to really restrict my risk exposure. I'm going to have a really sort of narrow set of basic services, and you'll see this in a standard AIA contract that basic services are just, like I said, basic and quite narrow. Whereas the list of additional services that architects can provide and that clients have to pay extra for is like super long. And so what's resulted is that clients take on a lot of the work, what we call upstream work of sort of visioning and planning a project, which is like really key to thinking about how that project is going to create impact. And it relegates architects to a really like specific, specialized, narrow area where they can create impact. And we thought about instead and asked these questions around is like, how can we add value at each of these stages? And how do we think about like our role and involvement from the visioning and planning process to really kind of setting a roadmap for how a project will create impact that will then guide the design and construction processes to be aligned with the organization's values, to be supporting community needs. And then also we believe that we should search for proof, and that in the evaluation of a project, we should be showing the power that architecture has and the role that architects play in creating vital social infrastructure for communities. And really kind of arguing that working throughout that spectrum, one can create greater impact in projects and project processes, but it also expands the agency of architects more broadly. So instead of that narrow approach of only kind of working on a small section of a project and its lifespan, that you're involved throughout the project's process, which one expands agency, creates more value for the partner, and gives the opportunity for architects to make more money. So I want to give a few examples of nonprofit organizations that have kind of calibrated to work in different ways at different stages of the project development process. So one is Epicenter. They are based in Green River, Utah. They're alumni of the Rural Studio, which I'll talk about in a second. They actually very rarely do design on built projects, but they've used their skills as trained as designers in design thinking to facilitate conversations on economic development, redevelopment, and renewal and community empowerment. So they have, for instance, like revived the Chamber of Commerce and like organized parades and brought in artists through artist fellowships to focus on projects like this sign that they collaborate with local residents in solving a community issue. And they've been really successful because they've created a ton of value for the city of Green River, and they've really kind of expanded the ways in which they work. So, design thinking has a lot to do with economic development. When you can create a community around, or really kind of rather elevate some of the important elements of a community that are attractive, and like use that to bring in and drive economic growth. And they've been really successful at doing that. I mentioned Rural Studio, Auburn University's program based in rural Alabama, Hale County, Alabama. And, I think this example is really a cool one. This is a fire station. And Rural Studio started really by focusing on building homes for people, affordable housing through participatory processes, using local, renewable, sometimes recovered materials. And one thing that they found in focusing on affordability in that community was that residents of Hale County were paying a disproportionate amount of their income for home insurance. And one of the reasons why home insurance was so expensive was that they didn't have a fire department. And that as a result, insurance companies were able to charge people much, much more than neighboring counties. So it just kind of exacerbated this issue of people were at risk, they're less resilient, and they're paying more money for it. And so what Rural Studio did was say, okay, well, why don't we organize a volunteer fire department and we'll build a fire station. And as a result, they can work on affordability for housing in a different angle. Like a lot of people look at affordability as architects, as like, how do we just reduce costs of materials? And I think they kind of looked at the full picture and said, well, how do we actually reduce costs that are out of pocket? And that, affordability in this case doesn't mean just making something cheaper. It means actually creating more wealth. And therefore people can afford higher quality homes. Another example that's overseas, this is in Kenya, Orchid Studio, formerly Orchid Studio, now called BuildX, has really focused on an integrated design build approach to working with their partners. And what they've been able to do with that then is focus on gender inequality in Kenya, and that their construction crews are almost all women. So they're able to sort of take on through the building process a major social challenge, and train and educate and empower women through well-paying jobs on their projects. And they're able to do that by calibrating a design build process that makes them more affordable for partners. So they're able to do primary schools, clinics, things like that an architect might not be able to do just solely as a design practitioner. And then there's our organization, and we've sort of attempted to work across the full spectrum of projects, of a project's development, from visioning and planning through design, construction administration, and now with our own construction company, and then doing research on impact to better understand our strategies and search for proof to really show like why our approach is valuable and really can improve people's lives. I'll give some examples of that. But first is that, we are structured as a nonprofit, and that means that we have a board of directors. We don't have any owners. We are now almost 200 staff around the world. And what that enables us to do is really, one, be proximate to the organizations we're serving, two, to bring in a really diverse array of voices to our partners' projects, and also just be able to remain mission focused. That as a nonprofit, we have a mission, and that honestly connects with a lot of our partners who they too are nonprofits. So, one of the core areas of like how we work is we find organizations that we think are doing really amazing work, and we find ways to support them and amplify their mission. So I think part of it is like who you select to work with and how you develop relationships with partners. And we actually don't use the term like client, because I think that oftentimes, sort of hopefully as you picked up in the background on some of the changes to organizational practice, the commodification of architecture means that sometimes you're treated as a vendor. And when you're treated as a vendor, then it's the client's prerogative to get the cheapest price they can, and it's the seller's prerogative to get the most profit they can. And that dynamic often doesn't achieve very good results. And what we found instead is like connecting on mission with our partners to really kind of understand their values and show that we can expand them has really been kind of key to our success. And as a result, we've done work in over 20 countries around the world and with 25 sovereign tribal nations. We have 6 offices, and this needs to be updated. We now have around 200 staff as of, I can tell you a little bit more about that in the Q&A session. But we're really excited and working throughout Sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia and then in North America as well. And, really focusing on like, how do we meet our partners' needs across typologies and, in rural and urban spaces. One of the kind of key practices that we use to kick off our design is what we call our impact-based design methodology. And like I was saying, one of the ways that we build a connection with our partners is that we actually develop the same vocabulary on what the project is meant to do. And how we do that is by developing a project mission. So just like an organization has a mission that they use to guide the decisions they make, to really highlight and make legible and clear the values that they stand for and like why they do what they do, we believe the project itself should have a mission too. And by having a project mission, then you can then select the kind of design methods and then the design decisions that will further that mission. So rather than going down like a conversation of like, I don't know, do you like red or blue, or do you want solar panels or not? That you can basically weigh the design decisions with relation to whether or not they expand and achieve that mission. And then how will that project mission create impact? So we want to then see kind of a direct connection from the methods we're choosing to the impact that we're trying to create. And then we also want the project to be thinking past its walls, like beyond the building, to the systems change or the behavior changes that can be achieved in its creation. So, we believe that there are direct impacts that can come from the building and the programming that are created and innovated. But then also we should be thinking about like, how will this building push the limits in a new way of, say, like, demonstrating a higher level of healthcare design in a place like Rwanda, or really raising the stakes and the bars of like what it means for education infrastructure in the U.S. As a nonprofit as well, like a lot of people are like, well, how do you work? Like, do you get paid? And actually, yes, like we do. So 90% or more of our revenue every year is actually earned income. So, we get paid just like most architecture firms do. But what we do that's different is we raise unrestricted dollars. We put it in what we call our Catalyst Fund. And we found that it's most effective when we invest in the early stages of a project's process for partners that we believe in, that we think are inspiring. And then we found through really kind of building the case for a project, articulating its mission and its vision and the impact that it's going to have in a community, can create, I think, a really compelling narrative that can help our partners unlock capital in philanthropic capital campaigns. It also means that we can build the case out for competitive grants through the U.S. federal government or international bilateral organizations like the World Bank. But what might be different here from like how a typical firm might do, say, pro bono services, is that all they're doing is effectively subsidizing this process. That you're just kind of chipping away and making something cheaper. And what you would see is kind of like a linear kind of structure across the spectrum here and across the project stages. And instead, what we're trying to do is actually like catalyze and then unlock funding. And we've been successful at that. In the past 5 years, we've deployed over $8 million in Catalyst grants to partners. And that's helped them unlock over $80 million in new funds they might not otherwise have been able to attain. We don't just think about the impact process within the design stages, but we also look at how we can bring that out through construction. So, rather than kind of thinking about, say, prefab that really limits the kind of impact you can create, we look at locally fabricated construction in both material selection and training, and local hiring as kind of key ways to create impact locally. And if you were to think about it, if any of you are from a small town, understanding like the size in terms of dollars of like a capital project, like a multi-million-dollar project, like that's a huge investment in a community. And to kind of like think about how that money just might pass by hiring a contractor that comes in and just, prop something up is really like a huge missed opportunity. So for us, like we really recognize that this money coming into a community should stay there, and we should figure out strategies for doing so, regardless of where we work. And it's going to be different in every context. But most recently, we've been actually exploring like, how do we add value to our partners in new ways? How do we work across that design process and add value at each of these stages? And for one is that we have developed a film team. We believe that film is like one of the kind of greatest mediums for communicating the impact of the design process. And rather than us tell the stories of the makers and our partners, that we found that film is a great way for them to tell their own stories. And so we've actually had a film team internally. We've been subsidizing that for quite a time, but now they're actually totally sustainable, supporting capital campaigns and communicating the work of our partners, most notably working with Ellen DeGeneres and the Ellen Fund on the Diane Fossey research campus we're building in Rwanda. We've also expanded into furniture. So, being able to effectively deliver like turnkey projects, but, use our process and our focus on mission and impact to think about like everything that goes into a building, not just the architecture and construction, but also the furnitures and fixtures. And so in Rwanda, we've partnered with over 85 women's groups, collectives, and other entrepreneurs to develop a full line of furniture that we can offer to our partners. We're actually now exploring like whether or not we would sell that kind of as a standalone retail operation. And then we've also integrated in terms of being able to offer design build services. So we have a construction arm that now employs about 900 people. And what that enables us to do is integrate design build, but really kind of ensure that like the integrity and fidelity of our impact-based approach carries all the way through a project's process, from the time it opens and how the building is operated. In terms of like R&D that I referred to in my intro, like we're in the US, we're also exploring like how do we make the case for design and the impact it can create in new areas where people don't necessarily see design as a potent agent of change. So in areas of, say, restorative justice, in food systems, in fringe cities, so in these sort of gateway cities that are outside of large metropolitan areas that are have kind of more recently been gutted by urban renewal efforts and the departure of many industrial employers. And then here in Santa Fe, also working with Native communities. So how do we work to support tribally run housing organizations and CDCs to close the housing gap that exists within Native communities? And so, we're exploring this as well, kind of pushing the bounds in different typologies, kind of outside of core architectural domains. And one of the ways we kind of think about this is like, how do we bring new processes to kind of a sustainable level? And if I were to kind of like sketch out our business model, like this is sort of how I might do it. And this is just the last part of the presentation, and we can have Q&A. So really, kind of generally, this may seem intuitive that, on this chart, you would see kind of a linear relationship between expertise and whether or not people will pay you for your expertise. So, as your expertise increases and you become kind of a market leader with like unique value adds, people are probably going to pay you more for that as you stand out. But as you're a new entrant and you don't have a lot of expertise, it's less likely you're going to get paid for that. And so what we've been doing is leveraging philanthropy for those kind of that new area where we're developing expertise. We have a theory of change that we want to test and, look at saying like, how can like we add value in creating more resilient food systems. We want to demonstrate that. And then, basically grow that to becoming a more sustainable kind of unique value add that we can bring to the market. And sort of now we have like kind of our core areas of practice of, what we're known for: healthcare, education, housing. And then we also have kind of our other services and our offices, Hudson Valley, Boston, Kigali. Like those are all, fairly developed, like where, they're more or less sustainable. They're mostly focused on earned income. And then we also have these kind of R&D new services. So the labs that I mentioned, some of our kind of newer studios in Santa Fe, Cape Town, and London. And then, kind of other services. So we have an engineering team with about 25 staff. We're doing furniture. We're doing construction as well. And what we've thought about that is kind of like having its path to scale set such that we identify what's sustainable, but then we also kind of like have an intense focus on those things that are in that R&D stage. So they're having a mix of philanthropy and earned income, with really the test is that, will people pay for this? Like, is it something that people find value in such that, it can actually operate sustainably in the future without relying on philanthropy? But it means that as a nonprofit, we can leverage philanthropy, grants and contributions to test new ideas, move them into R&D to really kind of see if these ideas stick, and that if they like kind of add they have a durable value proposition for our partners. And then, hopefully they eventually move up into the sustainable practice area. And, we've been pretty good at doing this so far. We're about 10 years old, have over $200 million of built work thus far. And, I think that our hope is we can continue to keep up with this pace and be a unique contributor to the market and to the model of practice of architecture. So I'll stop there. That's what I have. And happy to answer any questions you guys have.
How are business dealings in other countries different than in the US?
Yeah, good question. So we work with like a number of partners from foreign governments, ministries of health, to nonprofits and INGOs. And so I think in many cases, what we found is that there's like not certainly in Rwanda when we started, there was like not really a market for architecture. And what it meant was that we were having to bring philanthropy to the table and to the project to be able to really kind of do the kind of design that we thought and think is impactful and ultimately like good. And we've seen that change in Rwanda. We're now like competing against like David Adjaye and a lot of other like really renowned firms trying to do projects there. So I think it's been really cool to see that transition as we've kind of been in some ways a market leader working in a frontier area. In terms of like contracts and like risk, it's like very interesting. Our insurance companies see very little like risk of litigation for our work abroad. So, that's like fascinating to me. It means that there's a lot of more flexibility in the way a project is delivered. I think there's like a very standard way in the US that people think is like the way a project should be done. And we found that the kind of basic construct of or at least the economic relationship between capital and labor is more or less inverted when you work in low-income countries abroad. And so that means that importing materials, importing technology is relatively really costly compared to just hiring locally because labor is relatively cheap. So what it means is that we have like really labor-intensive processes and labor-intensive methods of project delivery. And that means that we can transfer more money to local communities. There's more opportunities for training. And there's actually more creative agency for our designers because it means that we can design a window, right? We can design a door. We can design like really all the features of a building because it's going to be made locally. And we can oversee that to ensure that it's done in a high quality way. So I don't know if that's like totally answering your questions, but that's kind of what we've seen is like the major difference of like work abroad in low income areas. And that there's just like not as rigid of an understanding and expectation about like what architecture is and what it's not.
I have a question, but I want to make sure I understand what you're saying first.
Sure.
Because you were talking about, right, you take people from like coming up with what are our goals for this, what are we doing, right, all the way to building the thing. And the front of that is like you're fronting your own money as a philanthropic organization to get the ball rolling. And then as it gets further along that scale, that's where you start actually making your money, right? Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, and this isn't the case with like every project. Like many partners have like raised money, they recognize that they should have a robust visioning and planning process, and so they want to like hire us to do that. But what we found is that by like investing in the visioning and planning process, where they can like really kind of link the community and social impacts to the project and to the project process, and be able to articulate and make that case, our partners are more successful as they launch a capital campaign because it's easier for them to justify the project. So like the alternative might be say like if you imagine say a healthcare organization is just like if their project narrative is like, man, like we're totally crowded, we have a lot of people sitting in an office, it's really tough for us to do our jobs. Like that's not nearly as inspiring as like being able to really link the development and expansion of their program to actually say, well, not only is it going to create like more space for us, but we're going to be able to innovate new models of care. And that those new models of care are going to be able to better serve, this population that we're not able to reach. And we're going to be able to do it, in this time frame and reach like this many people. So actually like showing the direct like impacts of the project to aid that narrative is like really important and has been really effective for our partners. And we found too that like just subsidizing a process and making yourselves cheaper by doing pro bono, like it doesn't really have a catalytic effect. And if people can't pay for design, they probably can't pay for construction or operation either. So by like limiting like where that investment happens, is often like a way that you're able to kind of like also vet a project's viability.
So I see a potential for a conflict of interest in that model, because
Hmm.
like how do you make sure that you're not, when you're visioning like what this organization needs, you're not misrepresenting what they need because you know it'll lead to this big multi-million-dollar project that'll be great for you and your portfolio.
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, like one is that, we're not crafting the narrative ourselves. That's through community engagement, through its immersion with our partners, and it's them talking about like what they're doing. So it's almost always like you'll see in like the creation of a development package and a project narrative, it's the voices of our partner and the communities that they're serving. And also like donors aren't dummies. Like they would see through something that's just like, you're just basically creating an inflated budget so you guys can pay yourselves. But what we found is that you can create really meaningful processes for engagement, for storytelling, for foregrounding the logic and the reason you're doing what you're doing, and partners doing what they're doing, and that people see that kind of authenticity, and that really is helpful in moving something forward. And so, I'll give you like a concrete example, like working with the Equal Justice Initiative and Brian Stevenson's team in the creation of the Memorial for Peace and Justice. Like our team was able to learn a ton and really kind of help develop some of the processes that were able to bring in family members and donors more closely to their cause of identifying the history of lynching in America and racial violence, and talking about its impacts. And so our film team helped capture some of the stories of family members of lynching victims. We helped them develop a process of community soil collection where community members were going and they were visiting lynching sites, documented lynching sites that EJI had done the history research around, and then gathering soil that now is in the museum in Montgomery, Alabama, from those sites. And that process of family members going back to the sites of where their family members were murdered, lynched, of donors, of community leaders, going through that process, like totally changed the trajectory of the project, its approval, and that's due in large part to Brian Stevenson and his like talent, but also it's like as designers, like we were able to sit with his team and kind of think through how that process would work, and really kind of like add some extra value, as a seat at the table. So, as a result, like they're able to raise, I can't say how much, but a lot of money to be able to make that memorial and that museum happen. And, I think that like design definitely played a role in that, in kind of complementing and supporting that cause.
One question I have, Matt, is the Catalyst Fund, which we've kind of danced around a little bit. How did you establish the Catalyst Fund?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I think that it's like sort of a chicken or the egg question. So we had a really incredible organization like recognize the work we were doing and want to invest in our organization, and they made a multi-year gift of unrestricted funding, like $1 million a year for over 3 years, so $3 million total. And at that time, I think our budget was like $3 million a year. So like to get $1 million check that's like unrestricted that you can kind of do whatever you want with was like crazy. And so what we did is basically developed a process where it said like, okay, like how do we best utilize these funds? You have $1 million, you have to figure out how to transform your organization. Like, how do you do that? So, what we developed was a fund that would be participatory. So any member of our team can pitch a project, and they would just do what we call a pitch sheet that would highlight how that project would have, one, we think a financial return on investment, like could it unlock capital for the partner, and develop a design fee such that we could continue to be involved in the project. Two, what kind of impact would that have? Like, if not for our involvement, would the project happen? Would it create impact in the community? And then also, like, would we learn something from it in a new way? So, is there an opportunity to learn and explore new typology, to to do novel research that would contribute to our understanding of an issue, or more broadly to the public's understanding of an issue. And so we kind of deployed it that way and left it open to our whole team to identify partners that they thought were super inspiring, or places that really could use our work. And that's how we started. And then I think after a couple of years, we found that like we had the best success when we could invest in the early stage part of a project that would really kind of like ensure that it's done well, and to help our partners in a way that it would be kind of like consider the counterfactual. Like if not for our involvement, like would the project happen? So that was kind of the origin of it, and also as a result of having like a construct of like telling people how unrestricted dollars are used, we had the basis to raise more dollars. So we went from, that $1 million commitment to doubling it to now raising over $2 million a year. And it's like, anybody's worked in nonprofits, it's like really hard to get unrestricted dollars from people that's saying like, trust me, give me your money and we'll use it in the best way. But we've been able to do that because we have like a really clear construct of saying like, we find partners that are inspiring, we make investments in projects that might not otherwise happen, and we have a track record of showing like great results.
Well, I have two questions, and you mentioned at the beginning that the organization is run, or you guys have a board of directors. How do they contribute to the organization, and what's their role in making decisions? I guess, how powerful are they? Sure.
Yeah. So our board is, I'll answer your first question, and I guess I'll hear your second. So the board is composed of folks that have a background in architecture, but also folks that don't. They have a background in public health. They have a background in nonprofit management. And ultimately, like, they advise at a high level on like strategic direction. So they review catalyst fund investments. They really guide the direction of the organization in terms of like giving feedback on how things are going. But there's sort of, if you've worked in nonprofits, there's like a kind of degree of involvement for boards. Some are like super hands-on, and they like want to like be involved in like hiring decisions and like really kind of minute stuff. And then there's like boards that just maybe they meet annually and they just kind of say, hey, great job, and we'll see you next year. Our board's like probably in the middle, where they meet quarterly. They're reviewing catalyst allocations, like I mentioned, to kind of be like, are these good investments? Like, what are the partners like? They're reviewing our financials as well. I think that many architecture firms certainly have cash flow issues. Cash flow is like a major issue, and so their expertise has helped us really kind of create a stable platform for our work. But one thing I should note that's kind of interesting, particularly because it's a pro practice class, is that many states in the U.S. actually, in order to practice architecture in the state, you need to be registered. You have to be owned by registered architects in that state, majority owned, or in some cases like New York, you have to be wholly owned by architects registered in that state. And as a nonprofit, your board of directors are not owners. So no one owns a nonprofit. They're effectively stewards of an organization that is working towards the public benefit. So they're fiduciaries. They're legally responsible for the organization, but they're not owners. And so one thing that we've found is like, definitely a challenge, and we've had to create sort of special entities and special structures such that we can practice in the U.S. But it kind of maybe gives an indication to you all of how like many people in creating architectural practice laws have not thought about the possibility of nonprofits practicing. That might be a little in the weeds for y'all, but I find it interesting. Did you have another question?
Yeah, my other question was with employees all over, I guess, the continent. How do you make sure that an employee in North America gets fair pay as the one in Rwanda is?
Yeah, really good question. In fact, I've been working on compensation review just recently, and I won't go into all the details. But yeah, it's like it's really hard because I think oftentimes we look at equity through the lens of like, are you paying people the same amount? And what, is kind of different is that you have very different markets of like where people are from, like what architects are paid. And so what we do is we look at really kind of like what are the different markets we're working in, and basically like what are people based on a similar skill level and education level paid, and then really try to anchor our pay that way. And so that means that in Rwanda, for instance, we're paying pretty much at the top of the market. Like they don't do kind of AIA compensation surveys in Rwanda, but we're pretty confident we're at like the 95th to 100th percentile. That said, though, like in the U.S., we're paying somewhere around the 50th percentile, so we're like kind of like at the average level in Boston. So like in the lens of fairness, we really look to like benchmark like what are people making that have similar levels of years experience, education, and are working in that market. So yeah, hypothetically, if you had a Rwandan come over and work in Boston, like that person would get paid on what the market bears. And similarly, like if we have folks that are coming from the US or third country nationals and go work in Rwanda, they're not making what they would be making in Boston. So we've like had to, figure out like what is the right structure here, like what is fair, and how do we also be competitive, because we often need third country nationals. We have, for instance, like a lot of UK engineers or engineers that are trained from the UK that are British working in Rwanda. So like, what do you pay them? And, do you pay them what they would otherwise be making in London, or do you pay them what an engineer in Rwanda makes? And we've had to find a compromise. So, it's neither. And that's been kind of tricky, but, we're very intentional with it. And we also review on the basis of gender parity. So we have had gender pay equity for the past 3 years that we've been tracking it. And, that's really important to us. We have almost 50-50 women and men as an organization. And this year, women are making on the average 5% more than men. So, these are some things that we think about. We actually recently engaged a diversity, equity, and inclusion specialist to really look at racial equity as well in our pay structure, and how do we improve on that. So, we're very intentional around it. It can be like a really complicated process because there's a lot of imperfect information. Like I mentioned, like you don't know the full Rwandan market like you do in having data in the US, but that's kind of the way that we've approached it.
Question about how you, go into a new community that you may not have a, employee in that area of the world. Like, how do you, welcome yourself in and not seem like trying to inflict your will upon them when they have no idea of the context?
Totally. Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So, I think it first starts with our partners. So, when we're looking at project partners, we look for organizations that are like really well rooted in their communities and they're really well respected there. And we often like work kind of out of that organization's position in the community. So they're helping us identify kind of key stakeholders. We're also kind of coming in and immersing ourselves in the context too and asking questions about who's not involved in the process. And that helps us a lot in terms of like the engagement process and the immersion to inform pre-design. When it comes to design and then construction, like we're like really open to like all different types of project delivery of like using local architects of record. And we have like kind of a whole slew of like case examples of like where we just send somebody off to live in, say, a really rural part of the Congo, Elima, Congo, for 18 months to oversee construction, and he just like lived there, to working pretty remotely with a local architect. Like in Nigeria, we're doing a genomics lab for infectious diseases that we've been working with a local architect to implement that. So so we've like found a number of ways to deliver projects, and that's meant like in Nigeria we did the full design for it. We have a project in Bangladesh where we're taking something through DD, and the local engineer and designer is taking it over from there. So yeah, we're like very open and have like very little ego about it, but really just kind of figuring out what's best for our partner and their context.
Okay, let me ask a question then, because so we have a mix of projects here.
Mhm.
Some are service, and I want to stand away. Some are service entities, some are products,
Mhm.
and so there's a mix. There, I would say that there are a handful that are really based on the idea of some sort of community impact. And I'm glad you just asked the question that you did. And so we have ideas of going into a community, find the need, help, things like that. We have ideas that, in my words, might be helping to tell the story, like you were talking about earlier. Is there a key, and maybe this is a play off of the last question, is there a key to whether it is a product or a service that they're working on, to figuring out, how do I go in, how do I really figure out what my clients, my partners, my customers, whatever the name is, what they really need and what they'll really value? Do you have a
like a key like method or kind of key approach? Is that what you're asking?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, just a second. I guess maybe I'm just doing it. So, yeah, I mean, I think that, like, first of all, if any of you all want to share some of the business ideas or like feedback, I'd be like happy to provide feedback. I can just say that and definitely, but he, generally, I think that like we have had a rule of what we call immersion, and what we, actually one of our partners, Brian Stevenson, puts it is like really getting proximate to the community and partners you're serving. So figuring out city partners and understanding what their challenges are, and I think that for us, like really finding organizations that we think are doing the good work, that are really authentic in what they say they're doing and committed to mission, like is one of the first ways to do that, because they can build the bridges and introduce you to folks, and you can come in with a level of trust that you might not otherwise be able to generate on your own. If like you're entering a community that like you're not a part of, there's a lot of different methods that I think that you could look to, that I think are ways to build trust and to learn about what those communities' needs are. We've developed like an internal manual that we call our immersion field guide of like different workshops and meeting structures and processes that help our team to better understand our partners and the communities they serve. IDEO.org has a really good one that's been around for a long time. Their human-centered design toolkit. I point a lot of people to that. I've used that in some of my classes for students to go out as they're searching for, really just kind of searching for ideas and challenges to work on. And there's a whole slew of like entrepreneurial like handbooks and like guides to like find that thing, that like challenge that you feel like you can take on. I would say like the key to the approach is like get rid of any like presupposed notions that you know better than the people that are in those communities, because you don't. And you might be trained as an architect, and for that reason you're going to see architecture as like something that you can fix and solve. Use your tools as something that you can like use, solve these challenges. But I think if you can like put that aside and like sit down and like listen, I think that you'll really kind of pick things up that you might not otherwise be able to pick up on.
All right. Thank you for that, Matt. I know that you have an event to at least attend, and really appreciate your time. Really appreciate everything that you shared with us today. I think in my mind, this has been one of the better presentations that we've had the entire semester. So, and also appreciate what Mass is doing around the globe. So thank you again, and keep up the good work.
Cool. No, thank you. And it's great that you guys are taking this class as like, you know, an alternative to the typical pro prac and really trying to find kind of entrepreneurial solutions and ways to adapt your skills. So, you know, like I mentioned, like if there are, you know, business ideas that you have or sort of ventures that you're developing that you want somebody to take a look at and kind of kick the tires on, I'd be happy to. So thanks and have a good rest of your evening.
All right, great. Thanks, Matt. Appreciate it.
Well, when you answered my question about how working abroad is actually more flexible than working in the United States, which I thought was really interesting, and how they really implored the community into being like the labor, so it's like kind of the most costly kind of
Yeah.
what you have to do.
Yeah, that was interesting. That the idea, and I guess it shouldn't be that surprising. I mean, we live in a very litigious society here in the United States, so I guess maybe it shouldn't be so surprising that it's actually more flexible as we go outside. But it was a little bit shocking to me as well to kind of hear it explained that way. Who else? Big idea or big takeaway from tonight? Yeah, why don't you come closer so we can hear it?
So one that really stuck with me was having a project mission. So they have a mission for the company and for their client, but having a project mission that we talked about being centered around, I thought that was really important, that their methods of design then follow the project mission, and then that following that was the impact, and then going beyond that, the system, does it drive change, behavioral change.
Yeah, I thought that was great. I was about to be jumping up and down over there because it's a lot like the purpose that we started out talking about for all of your projects. They're actually, or for all of your business ideas, they're actually applying that at the project level, which I think is really cool. Because how many of you have worked on an office or worked on a project in your whatever office you worked in, and it just, okay, this is how we do it, right? We're gonna do this, and then we're gonna do construction documents, and we're gonna pull these details from the library or whatever. Where their approach obviously is very different, but having a purpose or a mission that drives everything through that project, I think is really interesting. I think just the example that he used of, I think it was material costs. Have any of you in your work with firms ever encountered the term value engineering? Yeah. Every other day. Yeah, it's something that you're going to run into all the time. But as he's explaining, you know, to your point, as he's explaining that project mission, what does the mission say about the material choices, the uses, the labor force, things like that are probably going to head off some of those value engineering type conversations, because you're incorporating all that into that initial conversation. I thought that was really interesting. Any other big takeaways? Yeah.
I don't think he ever explicitly said it, but I think a theme that kept coming up was just listening well.
Yeah.
I know when he answered my question, he was like, "Well, we don't write the narrative, right? It's our clients who write the narrative. We are just there at the start to like facilitate their ability to write a compelling narrative." Great one.
Yeah.
And I think with Kyle's question with integrating into community, it seems like a lot of that is just like just listening.
Yeah. I think, and number one, I loved your question. I love that challenge, you know, of the idea. And I think you're exactly right. And, you know, when we're, you know, I think I've said this a couple times through the semester. What did I tell you that you have one job? I said, you got one job. What's that one job? change people's lives or help make people's lives or businesses better. Yeah, exactly. And, you know, a real fundamental question would be, how can you possibly accomplish that if you don't listen? Right? I love the response of, we don't write the narrative. And I think that sort of could apply to your project as well, is, are you helping people create their own narrative with your project? But how do you apply that, whether it's in a traditional architecture firm setting or with any of your projects? Remember, I think it's probably Anthony Vanke weeks and weeks ago that talked about, you got to have an idea, you've got to figure out who it's for, and you've got to figure out who's going to pay for it, right? Who's going to actually buy this thing? Who's going to pay you for this thing? How do you know any of that if you aren't asking questions and listening? And I think that's one of the big problems. I see this all the time with entrepreneurs and startups. When I first went out on my own, I had this idea, you know what, I would love to work with nonprofits and with startups because they really fit into my skill set. I think I can help them a lot, and I can. The one common denominator that those two also have that didn't work out so well for me as a business is neither one of them have any money. So, you know, how do you get paid? But in that world, or either one of those worlds, there are tons and tons of great ideas. And there are a lot of people that go a long way down the road to turning an idea into a business without ever asking those questions. Who's this for? Who's it going to help? I mean, they probably have a decent idea of that. Who's going to pay me for this? Who's going to buy this product? Who's going to buy this service? There's no way you can get to that understanding without listening. So I'm glad you opened the door to that part of the conversation.